Let's go to vertigo. Sorry about that. Well, thanks very much, Ian, for allowing me the time to speak to you. When a man starts a speech by talking about Augustine chapels, you know it's going to be potentially quite a long speech. That was relatively short, I thought, but it reminds me of a wonderful speech once given by two speakers at American universities. And a chap stood up and he said, I want to tell you what Yale means to me. Well, Y means blah, 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 about 5 minutes. A means blah, 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 5 minutes. L means blah, 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 blah. And E means blah, blah, blah. It's like a 20-minute speech talking about Yale based on the letters. The second guy got up and he said, well, I'm just very glad that he didn't come from the Massachusetts Institute. And I tell you, it's far from the truth. We still do a parliamentary reception every Christmas. And sponsors are interesting, aren't they? Yeah. Sponsor's speech. There's a standard format for a sponsor's speech, right? Get on, say who you are, get off. That's how our sponsor's speech should work. We had a sponsor, and I can't remember who it is, luckily, but she stood up and said, let me tell you what philanthropy means to me. Well, P means... well, these guys are going to go and vote in a minute. I'm not hanging about for this. But anyway, enough of that. Let me just talk to you for a few minutes, because you're standing there with drinks in your hands and there are drinks over there, so I won't speak to you for very long. But what I thought I'd do is just talk very briefly about what's happening in the sector at the moment, what some of the challenges are over the next few years, and just give you my thoughts on that and how the sector might prepare for times ahead. We were privileged Monday, we're doing these leadership breakfasts at the moment, and we were privileged on Monday to hear from Paul Johnson from the Institute of Fiscal Studies. And if you ever get a chance to hear Paul, he's an exceptional speaker. It was an extremely depressing way to start Monday morning because we asked him to speak to a large group of leaders in the sector about what was happening in terms of public spending over the next 5 years. And boy, is it a pretty difficult tale to tell. At first, those graphs don't look too... I'm not going that way, by the way, but at first they don't look too bad. The slope isn't too great. But of course, what he pointed out was there's quite a lot of areas in public spending that are now protected, some by law. So for example, overseas development spending is protected as a percentage of GDP. Health service spending is protected. Spending on schools is protected. So if you're in the bit of public spending that isn't protected, then it's going to be a pretty tough time. If you take those unprotected areas and you go from 2010 to 2020, the span of the coalition, and that's the assumed span of a Conservative administration, those areas will have been cut by about 36%. So if you're in local government, or if you're dependent on funding from local government, this is a particularly tough environment. At the beginning of the austerity era, we modelled 3 scenarios. One was a contract winning scenario. It assumed that voluntary organisations would do well in actually winning contracts in a contracting environment. We modelled a middle scenario, which we called proportionate cuts, which was essentially that the sector would suffer the same percentage sort of cuts as the public sector would have taken. And then we modelled worst case scenario, which was disproportionate cuts, that the public sector would hand on more cuts than they themselves would experience. We modelled that, we didn't model it, we forecast that, we looked at those as 3 scenarios. We've now got 2 years of data in relation to the austerity years, if you like. We're always a bit out of date with the almanac because we're analysing accounts. But we get a pretty good picture, a pretty good view of time series data. And what we see is that the reductions in public spending were worse than the worst case scenario that we were painting. We also did an analysis which looked at those areas of the sector that were most vulnerable to these changes. fairly crude analysis. We looked at the importance of that area of policy to the government. We looked at the percentage of public money in those sectors, and we looked in aggregate. I've got a great joke about funds. There was a line. And at the end of the line, I was Claire Short. Shows how old a joke it was. That Claire Short at the end of the line, and the Queen was doing the line-up. Just before she got to Claire, her phone went off. And the Queen said, "Oh, Claire dear," I said, "I do hope that's someone important." But so where was it? So as far as we looked at the vulnerabilities. The third area we looked at is how much reserves these areas were carrying in aggregate, i.e. how much capacity did they have to absorb the changes, how much capacity did they have to adapt to those changes. And so we did that analysis, and some areas continued to do well. Overseas development did remarkably well during that period because the government maintained the spend. It was an important priority. Health did okay, health and care did okay at that stage. Areas you wouldn't want to be involved in, advice work, got decimated during that period, no reserves, very, very publicly funded, no opportunity to adapt their business models to that well. And other areas, well, employment and training became a very tough area during that time, principally because of the way in which the government changed the contractual relationship. They went much bigger, they went to scale. Voluntary organisations don't operate at that scale. And they became quite vulnerable subcontractors to private sector primes. Whether that changes now with the rehabilitation of offenders work, or whether that changes with work programme 2, we've yet to see. So quite a difficult time for the voluntary sector. Two things happened apart from the public money and the changes in relation to the public sector funding. One was that philanthropy held up really well during that period. It continued to rise, not dramatically, but it continued to rise during what was quite a difficult period for citizens of this country. They continued to give. I'll come back to the fundraising issues in a minute because they're now very prominent in the public policy agenda. The other thing which is very noticeable during this period is that the voluntary sector started in broad terms to adapt to a very different funding model. So earned income as a proportion of total income increased quite a lot during that period. Now, this wasn't earned income necessarily from contracts because they were losing some contracts, particularly in employment. It was earned income and fees from individuals. The sector started to sell things more to individuals to sustain stuff. This is essentially the development of the social enterprise agenda. I've always thought social enterprise is more of a verb than a noun, and voluntary organisations started to behave in a more enterprising manner. In previous years, the concern was, have we got too close to the state? Have we begun to emulate the way that the state works? Are we too intertwined with the state's work? Now the debate became, have we become too close to the market? Are we now operating as the market operates? Are we selling stuff? NCBO is a microcosm of this in a certain way because we started the period with quite large government strategic funding. We've ended up with no government funding and a turnover of 9 million, 95% of which is earned. So I've learned just how much value added there is in sandwiches. So, if you want sandwiches, we can provide sandwiches. Conference facility. And our membership income has increased as well. So there's been a significant shift in the way that we do business, and in a funny way that's been mirrored in the way that the sector now operates. So that's where we arrive at this point. I suspect some of these trends will continue for the next 3 or 4 years. I don't see any sudden injection of public funds assisting the sector over this period. We might see a change in the way contracting is done, and that might advantage the sector a bit. I hope so in terms of employment policy, because the work programme has not only been a disaster for voluntary organisations, it's been a disaster for the people that are meant to benefit from work programmes. So I hope that that does change a bit, and we shall see. The bulk of the cuts will fall on the most vulnerable in our society, of course. It is the welfare budget that the state is really after. That's where it can really where it can make its biggest cuts. This will increase demand for the voluntary sector services. We will see a growth in those services as they respond to that particular area. We've seen the growth of food banks already. You can expect increased growth of grassroots voluntary organisation and activity. I want to talk about two more things before I finish. One is the way in which the sector is adapting. What are the models that it is using to adapt to that changing environment? And then some of the dilemmas that are there on the table for us at the moment. I think voluntary organisations are choosing one of two paths broadly, and this is a simplification. So there'll be lots of shades of grey in what I'm going to describe as black and white. One model is marketisation. They are becoming, they sell things. They become more entrepreneurial. They become more enterprising. Their business models are changing. Their governance will change as a result of that. We've seen the introduction of community interest companies, which have the ability to play, which are mainly public benefit, but have an element of private benefit. They can distribute dividends, although their assets are locked. So you'll see more models. B Corps are another way of doing this. There's a lot of thinking, talking, social investment, social enterprise. It's a nascent market, but it is developing. And voluntary organisations themselves will start to move in that direction. Some. The other strategy that some voluntary organisations will adopt in relation to this is a much more grassroots back to the future approach. They will look at their original missions. They will think that they can't sustain that mission by virtue of the way that they've been doing it, and they will switch back to an alternative strategy. An example of that would be British Conservation Volunteers, an organisation that Richard knows well, having worked with them for a long time. They've got a back to the future model. They were basically pinned to the wall with employment programmes. They couldn't win them. They couldn't win primes. They had nowhere to go in terms of that business model. So what have they gone back to? They've gone back to a model of community volunteering and environmental improvement, which was their original purpose of why they were created in the first place. And some organisations will go back to that. I was speaking in Sheffield the other day, and somebody asked me a question, which is quite a difficult question to answer. He was from the advice services. They didn't have any money, so he said, well, what's your advice then? And I said, well, you know, look at who else has got capacity within your community and see what you can do to align yourself with them. I used to chair, until a couple of years ago, it was a great privilege to do it, I used to chair Greenwich University, which I enjoy very much, mainly the funny hat and the clothes that you used to wear. They wouldn't let me keep the funny hat, actually. I was really upset about that. But the point there was that we built a new School of Architecture and Library in the middle of Greenwich. We got a law department. The law students want experience in giving advice. So with the right supervision, we were able to locate some advice work within this new structure with access to the public. So my only point there is that there may be new resources around that we're not thinking about, volunteering resources that we're not using effectively that might be useful. I'm going to finish by just posing a couple of interesting things that are around in the world at the moment. There are 4 Daily Mail headlines that you read about charities. And they go round and round and round and round and round. There'll be some more soon because it's August. Soon, so there'll be more. So we'll have to gear up, ready to say, no, that's not quite like how it is. It'll be salaries. You pick, you know, it's like a roulette wheel. You can pick any 2 or perm any 2 of these 4. It'll be salaries, fundraising, investments, or campaigning. It'll be one of those 4. They haven't come up. I'm trying to think of what the 5th might be. Probably expenses, actually. It'll be the 5th, if they really wanted to go for it. Those have to be dealt with, I think, on a tactical basis. The challenge to campaigning is mainly coming not from the public, but from the right. It's coming from the right-wing press, it's coming from certain MPs, and it has to be dealt with. We have to have best practice in campaigning, etc., etc., etc. Salaries, well, we tried to deal with that last year. We set up a group under Martin Lewis, who I think did a good report, which is basically be transparent about what you pay, and more importantly, be transparent about how you arrive at that number. In good practice, you should do it. We don't understand why charities are rushing to do that. Some of them are following that good practice, but they're going to be caught again. Because Mr. Hope, who writes for the Telegraph, will know what NCVO said, and he will be checking the top 50 charities' websites to see how many of them have agreed with, gone along with what NCVO advised. If they don't, our answer is simple. They should. Their answer might be more complex about why they haven't. So it's about transparency. And finally, funding. This is topic of the week. My view about this is quite straightforward. Although I suspect, in fact I said this in a speech last week, that the tragic death of Olin Cook was probably not related to fundraising activity. And I think once we dig under that, that is probably the case. Nevertheless, that tragic event has sparked a sort of public interest, I would say, in the way in which charities raise money. It's interesting, the One Show, I don't know if anybody saw the One Show, they were with Alistair, who runs the Fundraising Standards Board. They produced a standard letter online, which people could use to tell charities that they didn't want to be bothered anymore. In 2 days, there were 30,000 downloads of that letter. That is telling you something about the public's perception of what is going. We are overfishing the waters. And I think what's happened is our techniques have got out of kilter in some ways. So what's the solution to that? Well, the government has the power to introduce statutory regulation of fundraising. It can do it as a stroke of a pen. I think he doesn't even have to lay an order before Parliament. The Minister can do that. I think he doesn't want to do it. And if I were the Charity Commission, I wouldn't want them to do it because 2 reasons. I haven't got any money to do it, and B, the monkey's on my back. So what I think the best solution we can do, and I talked about this in more detail last week, or was it earlier this week? It's been a long week. Is actually we need to improve the self-regulatory structure for fundraising. It needs to be self-regulation. The sector needs to take responsibility for this. We've rather neglected the self-regulatory structure, and we need to get to grips with it effectively. Those are some of the challenges. But nevertheless, the sector continues to be optimistic, I think, about its future. It's a can-do sector, and I think it will continue to be a can-do sector. The challenges are there. They're financial. They're about public trust and confidence. But I think we've got the wit to be able to deal with those. And I guess you guys in this room are part of the solution and not part of the problem. Thank you very much.